The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Meridian Avenue as Maya Rodriguez adjusted her helmet, the weight of 37 years of living settling into her shoulders like accumulated dust. Her motorcycle, a weathered Yamaha that had carried her through countless late-night emergency calls as a paramedic, idled beneath her with mechanical patience. 2 blocks ahead, the crowd had been growing since noon, a river of humanity flowing between the concrete banks of downtown, their voices rising and falling in waves that reminded her of the ocean she'd left behind in her childhood. Officer Daniel Chen stood at the intersection's northeast corner, his radio crackling with updates that painted an increasingly complex picture. 23 years on the force had taught him to read crowds like weather patterns, and this one carried the electric charge of an approaching storm. The protesters weren't the usual mix of weekend activists and college students. These faces bore the weight of genuine grievance, carved by economic hardship and political disillusionment that ran deeper than any single issue. Their signs spoke of housing justice, police accountability, and economic inequality, the kind of systemic problems that couldn't be solved with a single arrest or dispersed with a firm command. Marcus Thompson wove through the crowd with the easy grace of someone who belonged, his press badge hanging from a lanyard that had seen too many similar gatherings. The freelance journalist's camera captured fragments of the larger story. An elderly woman in a wheelchair holding a sign about healthcare costs, a young father with a toddler on his shoulders, teenagers with faces painted in vibrant colors that masked their underlying anger. Each image told a piece of the narrative that mainstream media often missed, the personal stakes that drove people from their comfortable homes into the uncertain theater of public dissent. The air itself seemed to pulse with anticipation. Vendors had long since packed their carts and departed, leaving behind the scent of abandoned coffee and the ghost of normalcy. Traffic had been rerouted, creating an artificial calm on the surrounding streets that felt more ominous than peaceful. Maya could smell the tension as distinctly as she could smell the exhaust from her bike, metallic, sharp, with an undertone of something that might have been fear or might have been hope. From her vantage point, she watched the careful choreography of potential conflict. The protesters maintained their permitted boundaries with the discipline of people who understood the rules, even as their chants grew more fervent. The police formed a loose perimeter, their body language speaking of readiness, without aggression. It was a delicate balance, she realized, one that could tip at any moment. The crowd's energy shifted as a speaker took the makeshift stage, a woman whose voice carried the authority of lived experience. Her words painted pictures of systemic injustice that resonated through the gathered bodies like tuning forks struck in unison. Maya found herself nodding along, remembering the calls she'd answered in neglected neighborhoods, the medical emergencies that were really symptoms of larger social ailments. Officer Chen adjusted his stance, his training warring with his instincts. The crowd was peaceful, but peace was a fragile thing in spaces where power dynamics were so starkly displayed. He thought of his daughter, away at college, probably watching similar scenes unfold on her campus. The thought added another layer to his awareness, not just of what was happening, but of how it would be perceived, recorded, and remembered. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting the entire scene in golden light that seemed almost surreal, Maya made a decision that would change everything. She would take the long way home, riding the perimeter of the demonstration, bearing witness to whatever was about to unfold. The choice felt both insignificant and momentous, like stepping across a threshold she couldn't quite see. The first crack in the afternoon's careful equilibrium came not from the main crowd, but from a splinter group that had formed near the fountain in Memorial Square. Maya noticed them as she guided her motorcycle along the designated route. Young men and women whose energy felt different, more volatile, like a chemical reaction waiting for the right catalyst. Their signs were homemade, their chants more aggressive, and their positioning suggested they weren't interested in staying within the permitted boundaries. Officer Chen's radio crackled with increasing frequency. Reports filtered in from other sectors. A broken window 3 blocks north. A confrontation between counter-protesters and demonstrators near the courthouse. A minor scuffle that had been quickly contained. Each incident was small, manageable, but together they created a pattern that any experienced officer could read. The temperature was rising. Marcus found himself drawn to the edges of the main event, where the most compelling stories often unfolded. He'd covered enough demonstrations to know that the real drama rarely happened at the podium. Instead, it emerged from the spaces between groups, the conversations that happened in lowered voices, the moments when individual choices began to override collective discipline. His camera caught a heated exchange between two protesters, one advocating for peaceful resistance, the other pushing for more direct action. The disagreement wasn't violent, but it revealed the fault lines running through the movement itself. Maya paused at a red light, her engines idle, mixing with the distant sound of chanting. A young man approached her bike, his eyes bright with the fervor of someone who'd found his cause. He leaned in close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the detailed artwork on his protest sign, a piece that had clearly taken hours to create. "You riding with us or against us?" he asked, his tone suggesting the question was more than casual curiosity. The light changed before she could answer, but his words followed her as she accelerated through the intersection. The binary thinking he represented, the idea that neutrality was impossible, that everyone had to choose a side, was exactly what made situations like this so dangerous. Maya had seen enough human tragedy to know that reality was far more complex than the simple narratives that drove people into the streets. Officer Chen watched the splinter group with growing concern. They were moving with purpose now, their earlier random energy crystallizing into something more focused. His partner, Officer Sarah Williams, moved to join him, her expression reflecting his own unease. They'd both been through the department's crowd control training, but training scenarios never captured the weight of real human emotion, the way personal grievances could transform a peaceful gathering into something else entirely. The crowd's dynamics were shifting in subtle ways that only someone with Marcus's experience would notice. The concentric circles of protesters were tightening, their spacing becoming more compact. Conversations were getting louder, more animated. The peaceful majority was still maintaining order, but the margins were beginning to fray. Maya's route took her past a group of older women who'd set up a water station for the protesters. Their faces showed the kind of maternal concern that transcended political divisions. They were there not because they agreed with every demand, but because they recognized the humanity in the demonstrators' passion. One of them waved at Maya as she passed, a gesture that somehow contained both blessing and warning. The sun was lower now, its angle creating stark contrasts between light and shadow that made the entire scene feel more dramatic. Maya realized that she was no longer just observing. She was becoming part of the story. Her presence, her choices about where to ride and when to stop, were adding her own thread to the complex tapestry being woven in the streets. Officer Chen's radio buzzed, with a report that made his stomach tighten. The splinter group had left Memorial Square and was moving toward the main demonstration. Their path would take them directly through the most densely packed section of protesters, where any disruption could cascade into something much larger. He began moving in that direction, his training taking over even as his mind raced through potential scenarios. The critical moment was approaching, though none of them could have predicted exactly how it would unfold. The collision of forces began with something as simple as a misstep. Maya had positioned herself at the intersection of 5th and Meridian, her motorcycle providing an elevated perspective on the converging crowds. The splinter group had reached the main demonstration, their arrival creating a ripple effect through the packed bodies like a stone dropped into still water. She could see the tension in people's shoulders, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence as attention shifted to the newcomers. Officer Chen was moving through the crowd with practiced efficiency, his presence both calming and alert. He'd identified the potential flashpoint and was working to intercept the splinter group before they could disrupt the main event. But crowd dynamics were like river currents, seemingly manageable until they reached a critical mass, then suddenly overwhelming in their power. The moment that changed everything was almost absurdly mundane. A protester carrying a large banner stumbled slightly as the crowd pressed around him. His banner pole swung wide, catching the shoulder of a young woman from the splinter group. She spun around, her face already flushed with the adrenaline of the moment, and saw not an accident, but an aggression. Her shout cut through the ambient noise like a blade. "They're attacking us!" Maya watched the lie take on its own life, spreading through the crowd faster than truth could follow. The young woman's companions surged forward, their earlier energy finding its outlet in this manufactured crisis. The banner carrier, confused and increasingly frightened, tried to explain, but his words were lost in the rising voices around him. Marcus raised his camera, knowing he was witnessing one of those pivotal moments that would define how the entire day was remembered. His lens captured the exact instant when misunderstanding transformed into confrontation. The way faces changed, the way bodies tensed, the way space itself seemed to contract as people pressed closer together. Officer Chen was 20 feet away when the first punch was thrown, not by the original antagonist but by someone else entirely, a middle-aged man who'd been caught up in the crowd's energy and saw violence as the only way to protect those around him. The punch missed its intended target and caught an innocent bystander, an elderly man who'd been trying to move away from the commotion. The crowd's response was immediate and chaotic. Some people pressed forward, drawn by the drama or driven by their own grievances. Others tried to retreat, creating a dangerous compression as bodies pushed against bodies. Maya could see the panic beginning to spread. Not the organized panic of a natural disaster, but the more dangerous kind that emerged from human conflict. Officer Williams was the first to reach the disturbance, her training kicking in as she tried to separate the combatants. But her arrival only escalated the situation. To some in the crowd, she represented exactly what they'd come to protest against. To others, she was protection from the violence that was spiraling out of control. The complexity of her role, protector and symbol of oppression simultaneously, made her presence both necessary and inflammatory. Maya made a split-second decision that would haunt her for weeks afterward. She revved her engine and began moving toward the crowd, not to escape but to help. Her EMT training had taught her that in chaotic situations, the most important thing was to create space, to give people room to breathe, to think, to make better choices. But motorcycles in crowds were dangerous under the best circumstances, and these were far from the best circumstances. As she maneuvered between the packed bodies, someone stumbled backward into her path. Maya braked hard, her rear wheel sliding on the asphalt, and for a moment that felt like hours, she fought to control the bike. Officer Chen saw the motorcycle, began to slide, and understood immediately what was about to happen. He lunged forward, his body moving before his mind could calculate the odds. The bike was going down, and anyone in its path would be seriously injured. His choice was instinctive. Place himself between the falling motorcycle and the crowd, accepting whatever consequences followed. The impact came with a sound that seemed to silence everything else. Metal against asphalt. The grunt of human effort. The collective gasp of witnesses. Maya hit the ground rolling, her protective gear absorbing most of the impact. But Officer Chen caught the full weight of the motorcycle across his legs, the mechanical force crushing bone and flesh with indifferent efficiency. In the sudden silence that followed, every person in the crowd became a witness to something that transcended their individual grievances. The abstract had become brutally concrete, the political had become intensely personal, and the careful boundaries between us and them had collapsed in the face of shared humanity. The silence lasted exactly 7 seconds. Marcus would later verify this from his camera's timestamp. But those 7 seconds contained an entire shift in the crowd's consciousness. The sound of Officer Chen's radio, still clipped to his belt, calling for backup with mechanical persistence, became the only sound in a space that had been filled with hundreds of voices just moments before. Maya pulled herself upright, her EMT training overriding the shock and adrenaline that flooded her system. The motorcycle lay on its side, engine still running, fuel beginning to pool beneath it, but her attention was entirely focused on the man trapped beneath it. A police officer whose name she didn't know but whose pain she could read in the rigid set of his shoulders and the careful way he was breathing. "Nobody move," she called. "Out," her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years managing medical emergencies. "I need space to work." The crowd responded immediately, stepping back to create a circle around the accident scene. The same people who had been shouting at each other moments before now worked together, hands reaching out to steady those who stumbled, voices offering quiet reassurance. Officer Williams dropped to her knees beside her partner, her professional training warring with personal fear. She'd seen Chen injured before, a knife wound 2 years ago, a concussion from a domestic violence call that had gone wrong. But this was different. The weight of the motorcycle had done serious damage, and they were surrounded by people who, minutes ago, had been viewing police as the enemy. Marcus lowered his camera, the journalist in him recognizing that this moment required participation rather than documentation. He moved to help several protesters who were working to safely shut off the motorcycle's engine and clear the fuel spill. The young man who had approached Maya earlier was now directing people away from the hazard, his earlier aggression transformed into protective concern. "I'm a paramedic," Maya told Officer Williams, pulling medical supplies from the kit she always carried. "Let me help." The statement created a moment of hesitation. In the current political climate, trust between civilians and police was a fragile thing. But Williams looked at her partner's pale face and nodded. As Maya began her assessment, she was aware of the crowd reforming around them. The earlier division between protesters and police hadn't disappeared, but it had been complicated by the immediate reality of someone's suffering. She could hear conversations starting up again, but the tone was different now, quieter, more thoughtful, tinged with the kind of reflection that only comes after witnessing something that couldn't be easily categorized as right or wrong. The elderly man who had been accidentally punched was now sitting on the curb, holding a cloth to his bleeding nose. The young woman whose shout had started the confrontation stood beside him, her earlier anger replaced by something that looked like shame. She kept apologizing, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to explain what she'd been feeling, why she'd reacted the way she had. "His leg is broken," Maya announced, her hands working to stabilize Officer Chen's injury. "Possibly the ankle, too. We need to get the weight off him before we can move him." It was a complex problem that required careful coordination, and Maya found herself becoming the natural leader of an impromptu rescue team that included protesters, police officers, and bystanders. The splinter group that had caused the original disruption was now fully integrated into the rescue effort. Their earlier energy had found a constructive outlet in the physical work of lifting the motorcycle and creating a safe path for the approaching ambulance. The same young man who had been advocating for direct action was now following Maya's medical instructions with careful attention. Officer Chen, despite his pain, was conscious and alert. Maya could see him watching the crowd's response to his injury, his expression cycling through surprise, gratitude, and something that might have been recognition. The people he'd been trained to see as potential threats were now working to save him, their actions revealing the complex humanity that political rhetoric often obscured. As the ambulance arrived, its red lights painting the scene in intermittent color, Maya realized that something fundamental had shifted. The accident had created a shared experience that transcended the ideological divisions that had brought everyone to the streets. It hadn't resolved the underlying issues that had motivated the protest, but it had reminded everyone involved that those issues were ultimately about human beings, people with families, fears, hopes, and the capacity for both conflict and compassion. The crowd began to disperse naturally as the paramedics took over Chen's care. But the dispersal was different from the usual end of a demonstration. People lingered, continuing conversations that had been interrupted by the accident. The sharp edges of earlier confrontations had been softened by the shared experience of crisis and response. Maya watched the ambulance pull away, knowing that her involvement in the day's events was far from over. 3 weeks later, Maya found herself in the hospital corridor outside room 314, holding a small potted plant that seemed inadequate for the weight of what she wanted to express. The sterile smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint aroma of cafeteria food, creating an atmosphere that was both familiar and foreign to someone who usually encountered medical facilities in the chaos of emergency response. Officer Chen was sitting up in bed when she knocked, his right leg elevated in a complex arrangement of pulleys and supports. His face showed the particular exhaustion that came from pain medication and disrupted sleep, but his eyes were alert and curious. The recognition was immediate. They had shared something that couldn't be forgotten even if they hadn't been formally introduced. "I brought you something," Maya said, setting the plant on his bedside table. "It's a peace lily. Seemed appropriate." The joke was gentle, testing the waters of what kind of conversation they might have. Chen smiled, the expression transforming his face in a way that made him look younger and more approachable than he had in uniform. "I've been wondering if you'd come by. I wanted to thank you, not just for the medical care but for how you handled the whole situation. You kept things from getting worse." The conversation that followed was unlike anything either of them had expected. Chen talked about his 23 years on the force, the gradual erosion of trust between police and community, his own struggles, with the gap between the job he'd thought he was signing up for and the reality of modern policing. Maya shared her experiences as a paramedic, the way emergency medicine had shown her both the best and worst of human nature, her growing understanding of how systemic problems manifest in individual crises. "The weird thing," Chen said, adjusting his position carefully, "is that getting hurt by your motorcycle did more to change my perspective than 20 years of diversity training. Not because of the accident itself, but because of what happened after, the way people responded." Maya nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I've been thinking about that too, about how quickly the whole dynamic shifted once everyone remembered that we're all just people trying to get through the day." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Marcus Thompson entered, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the slightly apologetic expression of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," he said. "I wanted to show you something." The envelope contained prints of the photographs he'd taken during the demonstration and its aftermath. The images told the story in a way that words couldn't capture. The progression from organized protest to chaotic confrontation to collaborative rescue effort. One photograph in particular stood out. Maya working on Chen's leg while protesters and police officers worked together to clear the scene, their faces showing the kind of focused cooperation that transcended political boundaries. "I've been trying to decide what to do with these," Marcus said. "The story that most outlets want is about the confrontation, the violence, the failure of the system. But that's not the whole truth, is it?" They spent the next hour looking through the photographs, each image prompting memories and reflections. The young woman who had triggered the initial confrontation appeared in several shots, her expression evolving from anger to shame to determined helpfulness. The elderly man with the bleeding nose was shown being cared for by the same people, who had been fighting moments before. "What strikes me," Maya said, studying one particular image, "is how normal everyone looks. I mean, when you're in the middle of it, everyone seems larger than life, more threatening or more heroic than they really are. But in these pictures, we all just look like people dealing with a difficult situation." Chen pointed to a photograph of Officer Williams coordinating with protesters to redirect foot traffic around the accident scene. "Sarah told me later that she'd never felt more supported by a crowd in her entire career. These were people who had come to protest police actions, but when someone needed help, they didn't hesitate." The revelation that emerged from their conversation was both simple and profound. The political divisions that had brought them all to the streets that day were real and important, but they existed alongside a deeper human capacity for empathy and cooperation. The accident hadn't resolved the systemic issues that had motivated the protest, but it had demonstrated that those issues could be addressed without dehumanizing the people on different sides of them. Maya left the hospital with a new understanding of her own role in the community. She had always seen herself as politically neutral, focused on the immediate medical needs of whoever required help. But neutrality, she realized, wasn't the same as passivity. Her actions during the demonstration, her decision to get involved, her medical intervention, her leadership during the rescue, had been inherently political acts, even if they weren't partisan ones. 6 months later, Maya would find herself testifying before the city council about the need for better crowd management protocols and improved community policing initiatives. Officer Chen, recovered from his injuries and assigned to a new community liaison position, would become an advocate for police reform from within the system. Marcus's photographs would be displayed in a downtown gallery, part of an exhibition called Common Ground, that sought to complicate simple narratives about social conflict. But on that afternoon in the hospital, as the three of them looked through images of a day that had changed all their lives, the most important realization was quieter and more personal. That the work of building a better society happened not just in the grand gestures of protest and policy, but in the small moments when people chose to see each other's humanity despite their differences. The peace lily on Chen's bedside table would bloom 2 weeks later, its white petals opening, like a small flag of truce in the sterile hospital room. A reminder that even in the most unlikely circumstances, something beautiful could grow.